If the psychopathological focus is misleading, the reading of Russia's great historical crisis in the 20th century that accuses the Bolsheviks, and Stalin in particular, of having developed a vision of the world that's totally blind to moral and human reason is not much more convincing. Rather, if we begin with the years or decades that precede October 1917, we see that the roles of accused and accusers can easily be inverted. It's the protagonists of the revolutionary movement who see the world they intend to overthrow as responsible for the crimes which today are attributed to them. Communism leads to genocide? In the years of the First World War, the liberal and bourgeois society that they tried to overthrow was synonymous with genocide. While Stalin speaks of the bloody massacre and the massive extermination of the living force of the peoples, 814 book herein describes it as a horrible corpse factory. 815 terrible yet precise is the description that Rosa Luxemburg makes. The mass extermination and the genocide that takes place is something daily and boringly monotonous. Meanwhile, in the rear an atmosphere of ritual murder takes hold. Karl Liebknecht will also call for a struggle against genocide. In fact, he speaks against the triumph of genocide, condemning as well the glorification of brutal violence, the shipwreck of all that is noble in the world and the spread of moral barbarization. While it leads him to welcome the October Revolution, his moral indignation over the horrors of the First World War leads Liebknecht to predict not only a solid state but also a tough state for Soviet Russia, at least a state able to prevent the tragic return of a system denounced even before the war for its lack of moral scruples. 816 Finally, it's worth citing Trotsky, the Cainite labor of the patriotic press on both sides as the irrefutable demonstration of the moral decadence of bourgeois society. Yes, one cannot help but speak of moral decadence when they see humanity fall back into a blind and ruthless barbarity. One witnesses the outbreak of a mad and bloody competition to utilize the most advanced technology for military means. It's a scientific barbarity, which uses the great discoveries of humanity only to destroy the basis for civilized social life and to annihilate mankind. All the good produced by civilization drowns in the blood and entrails of the trenches: health, comfort, hygiene, everyday relations, the bonds of friendship, professional duties, and lastly, the apparently unshakable rules of morality. 817 The term genocide is also used with a small variation by Trotsky, who in 1934 warns of the possibility of a new world war, a new recurse to genocide that gathers on the horizon. 818 As late as August 31, 1939, Molotov accuses France and Britain of having rejected the Soviet policy of collective security in the hope of pushing the Third Reich against the USSR, thus without a doubt provoking a new large massacre, a new Holocaust of the nations. 819 It's clearly moral indignation that inspires this denunciation of the horrors of war. A leading American statesman like Theodore Roosevelt has a completely different position on it. Between the end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th century, he celebrates war in vitalizing terms, coming from a perspective that in some form seeks to move, you could say using Nietzsche, beyond good and evil. We read, "All men that have within them the ability to enjoy battle know how it feels when the beast begins to enter their heart. He does not step back in horror at the sight of blood or thinks that the battle should stop, but enjoys the pain, the regret, the danger as if it adorns their triumph." 820 They are themes that, in their more attenuated forms, continue to resonate in Churchill who, in reference to the colonial expeditions, affirms that, war is a game during which one should smile. The escalating carnage in Europe that starts in August of 1914 doesn't diminish this outlook. War is the greatest game in all of history, here we play with the greatest stakes. War constitutes the only meaning and purpose in our lives. 821 Moving on from the celebration of war in crudely vitalistic terms, to its translation into spiritualist terms, The First World War will be welcomed by Max Weber as great and marvelous, while Benedetto Croce hopes to get a regeneration of current social life out of it. 822 along with numerous other leading figures of the liberal West at the time. Among them we must also cite Herbert Hoover, a notable representative of the American administration and future President of the U.S., who immediately after the signing of the armistice attributes to the just concluded conflict the purpose of the purification of men and therefore the preparation of a new golden age. We are proud to have taken part in this rebirth of humanity. 823 Yet Lenin continues to stick to his moral political condemnation of war. Together with it he denounces the social political system that, in his opinion, caused it. It is evident the moral pathos that inspires the Leninist analysis of capitalism and colonialism in particular. This is how the Italian War in Libya is described, that typical colonial war by a 20th-century civilized state. We see a civilized and constitutional nation perform its civilizational work by means of bayonets, bullets, the noose, fire, rape, even by means of butchery. In fact, it's a massacre by civilized and refined men, a massacre of Arabs through the use of the most modern of weapons. As punishment, nearly 3,000 Arabs have been massacred, entire families have been robbed and massacred, children and women massacred. 824 The advent of the most advanced bourgeois republic doesn't in any way put an end to this horror. With no less cruelty the armies of Republican France exterminate the African peoples. 825 The denunciation of the genocidal practices of the West occupies a central role, especially in the overview given by Lenin in the Notebooks on Imperialism, which collects material extracted from liberal bourgeois literature at the time. A year before the outbreak of the enormous conflict, in a book by a German author, one can read, "The struggle for existence becomes harder, the hostilities among Europeans escalate and lead to attempts at mutual annihilation." On the other hand, the policy of annihilation is already a reality in the colonies. In Africa the Hereros are in large part annihilated by Germany, which in repressing the Hottentot uprising can also count on the active collaboration of Britain. But let's see how the leading country of the liberal West conducts itself in its colonies. The British have exterminated the inhabitants of Tasmania to the very last man. But the Irish are not Tasmanians. It's not simply possible to kill them all. Despite being subjected to merciless rule and repression, in South Africa blacks multiplied to a concerning degree. Some colonists openly desire an insurrection to halt the dangerous growth of the Kaffir population and to erase their rights, including to their land. 826 Cold and expressionless, these descriptions become charged with moral indignation in passing from bourgeois historians to Lenin, who notes, "These are the results of the colonial wars, thanks to the expropriation and annihilation of the Hereros. The new arrivals can steal the land and become landowners." 827 No less charged with moral indignation is the reading that Stalin makes of colonialism. But Theodore Roosevelt appears to preemptively respond to this denunciation of the enslavement and genocidal practices that take place in the colonies. Quite fortunately, the tough and energetic politicians who were the pioneers of the difficult job of civilizing barbarian territories didn't allow themselves to become overtaken by false sentimentalism. Those sentimental philanthropists who were moved by the fate of the colonized peoples should be considered worse than professional criminals. 828 The same can be said of General Bugeaud, considered by Tocqueville as a model of energy and unequaled vigor at the time of leading the only type of war that can be waged in Africa. 829 In our days, is communism synonymous with a total state and with totalitarianism? In the years of the First World War, it was the capitalist countries, including those of liberal orientation, who incarnated all that. Lenin highlights the fact that what impedes fraternization on the front lines is a penal colony discipline, and that even the rearguard posts have become military prisons. 830 Civil society is subjected to the same iron fist discipline. In referring to that, the Russian Revolutionary highlights the relevance of the analysis made some decades earlier by Engels, according to whom the growing militarization and the competition for greater conquest drives political power to the point that it threatens to consume the entire society, even the state. 831 Bukharin, for his part, in denouncing the centralization of the garrison state and the iron heel of the militarist state, spots on the horizon a new Leviathan, to which the fantasy of Thomas Hobbes seems like child's play. 832 It's a theme that is also found in Stalin, for whom war ends up mutilating or destroying democracy even where it appears to be more rooted. Contrary to Russia, in Britain national oppression doesn't generally assume the monstrous forms of massacres and pogroms. It was less grave, less inhuman, but with the outbreak of hostility the situation deteriorates drastically, as both Irish and Indians had to experience firsthand. 833 Even the Western democracies tend not to differentiate themselves from a country characterized by a fierce and inhumane autocracy. One can counterpose this language to the frequent use in the writing of Roosevelt of words like virile, imperial, able-bodied. 834 A prose that again transmits an attitude beyond good and evil and a cult to a willpower lacking any moral limits. As you can see, the commonplace reading that likes to oppose the moral sense of the liberal bourgeois world to the communist movement's Machiavellian lack of scruples doesn't stand up to historical analysis. Immediately after the October Revolution, approvingly welcomed by him, the young Lukács sees in the historic movement for socialism a radical settling of accounts with realpolitik. 835 For Benedetto Croce, however, the Bolsheviks and the Russian revolutionaries are the object of hatred and ridicule, who represent moralistic politics. They have opened a great courthouse of justice, calling everyone to be examined in the name of morality, about their war objectives, to scrutinize them, accepting the honest and excluding the dishonest. Thus, proceeding in a moralistic way, they have made public all previous diplomatic treaties, considered immoral for having planned the war with the aim of obtaining territorial conquests. But the liberal philosopher objects, it's absurd to want to make moral judgments on states and to treat politics like morality, in the place where politics is politics, and precisely politics, and nothing more than politics, and their immorality consists solely and entirely in being politically excellent. Therefore, it doesn't make sense to argue for awarding rights to those who don't know how to win them or don't know how to defend them, placing limits and responsibilities on those who rightly, out of their own conviction and by shedding their own blood, don't recognize any other limit or obligation outside those suggested or put in place by their own mind and strength. 836 One can say that Stalin has the ideal response to Croce on March 10, 1939. At a time when the partition and tragedy of Czechoslovakia takes place, thanks to Munich and the complicity of the West, who refuse to condemn it and seek to contain the expansionist willpower and vitality of the Third Reich, doing everything possible to direct it to the East, it's naive to lecture people who don't recognize human morality. Politics is politics, as the old and experienced bourgeois diplomats say. 837 Let us concentrate on the First World War. It's worthwhile to reread what Vilfredo Pareto wrote in 1920. Before the conflagration, the proletarians and especially the socialists said they were ready to prevent it with a general strike or by still more radical means. After such beautiful speeches the World War began. The general strike doesn't happen, while in opposition in various parliaments, the socialists approved the funding for the war, or didn't make too much opposition to it so that the principle of the teacher, workers of the world, unite, implicitly transformed into another, workers of the world, kill yourselves. 838 Stalin appears to have preemptively responded to Pareto, who, at least at this time is a typical representative of the liberal bourgeois world, and who doesn't hide his cynicism and satisfaction over the bloody defeat of socialist internationalism. But the words of Stalin reverberate with moral indignation and, at the same time with hope. Quote, 3 years have passed since the workers of the world, a day before still brothers, now dressed in uniforms, lined up to face each other as enemies, and who today injure and kill each other, to the enjoyment of the enemies of the proletariat. The Russian Revolution is the first to open a breach in the wall that divides the workers against each other. At a time of general patriotic intoxication, the Russian workers are the first to raise the forgotten slogan, "Workers of the world, unite." 839 unquote. In the new situation created in Russia, it's possible to resume the struggle to put an end to the massacre and to promote mass confraternization on the fronts and new bonds of fraternity among the peoples. 840 To achieve this result, however, it's necessary to go beyond the February Revolution. The life in the trenches, the true lives of the soldiers, created a new instrument of struggle, mass confraternization, which the provisional government nevertheless opposes, calling for an offensive and for new bloodbaths. 841 And it threatens to send to military courts those guilty of confraternization. 842 It's true, in its clandestine period, the Bolshevik Party and Stalin eventually carried out their struggle against the autocracy using violent methods, and historians committed to depicting Stalin as a gangster since his youth make use of that past. What is there to say of this approach? Let's make a comparison with Churchill, 5 years older than Stalin. The future British statesman begins his career by fighting and sympathetically describing the wars of the British Empire, including the least glorious ones. While in Sudan they don't take prisoners, in South Africa the conquerors create concentration camps, destined to become a tragic model. From these experiences, Churchill begins to distinguish himself as a political leader, passionately fighting for the defense of the British race and the white race in general. To achieve this outcome, it's not enough to strengthen control over the colonial peoples, it's necessary to intervene in the metropole as well. They must proceed toward the forced sterilization of the feeble-minded, misfits, those presumed to be habitual delinquents. At the same time, idle vagabonds should be locked away in work camps. Only this way could a national and racial threat impossible to exaggerate be adequately confronted. The author who cites these fragments comments, as the Home Secretary in 1911, Churchill was the author of draconian measures that had conferred upon him an almost unlimited personal power over the lives of individuals. 843 Are Churchill's origins truly more inspiring than Stalin's? Years later, while the latter, from a prison in which he was placed by the Tsarist regime allied to Britain, dreams of the confraternization of soldiers and nations, the former is dedicated to carrying out until the very end a war that his view is destined to strengthen the hegemony of the British Empire and the British race. In conclusion, for a historian who ends their work in October of 1917, it would be very difficult to point to the Bolshevik Party and to Stalin as the side in the struggle that ignores moral reasoning.